January 1944. Eastern England. Frost clings to the grass beside the runway. The air smells of fuel and wet canvas. 4-engine bombers sit heavy and silent, then come alive, propellers biting at the cold, exhaust turning white as it rolls away on the wind. Men in shearling jackets watch the sky like it can warn them. They've learned the pattern. Climb, form up, cross the coast. Then somewhere over Europe, the escort turns back, leaving aluminum formations to fly on alone, straight into a system built to tear them apart. But this morning, another sound holds in the background. Lighter engines, a tighter note. Long wings lift into the same winter air and refuse to fall away. The Mustang doesn't promise safety. It promises something the Luftwaffe has not had to face at this distance, an enemy that can stay. We tell real World War II stories every day. Subscribe and tap the bell to keep history alive. By the winter of 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a point of strain that could no longer be managed by courage alone. The United States Army Air Forces had committed to daylight precision bombing. The theory was direct and uncompromising. Destroy German industry from the air, break the machinery of war, and do it in daylight so targets could be identified and hit with intent. It was a doctrine built on faith in formation flying, defensive firepower, and disciplined crews. Reality proved harsher. American heavy bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortress, and the B-24 Liberator, were designed to fight their way through enemy skies. Box formations layered machine guns in overlapping arcs, turning bomber streams into flying fortresses in fact as well as name. Against small numbers of interceptors, the system worked. Against a coordinated, experienced Luftwaffe, it did not. German fighters learned quickly. They attacked head-on, where closing speeds were extreme and defensive fire was weakest. They focused on stragglers, damaged aircraft, crews falling behind, formation by minutes that felt like seconds. Flak batteries ringed cities and industrial regions, forcing bombers to hold altitude and course longer than any crew wanted. The most dangerous stretch came after the escort fighters turned back. Early American escorts, the P-47 Thunderbolt and the Spitfire, were formidable machines, fast, heavily armed, but range was their limit. Fuel constraints forced them to peel away deep inside occupied Europe, leaving bombers alone for the final, most lethal leg of the mission. This unprotected region became known among airmen, not as a tactical gap, but as a sentence. In October 1943, raids such as the 2nd Schweinfurt mission drove the lesson home with clarity that could not be argued away. Losses reached levels that threatened the campaign itself. Aircraft could be replaced. Crews could not at that rate. Inside Allied headquarters, the question sharpened. Either a fighter could be built that stayed with the bombers all the way to the target and back, or daylight bombing would have to be reconsidered entirely. At the edges of this problem sat an aircraft that had not yet fulfilled its promise. The P-51 Mustang was fast, efficient, and aerodynamically clean, but with its original Allison engine, its strengths faded at the high altitudes where the air war was being fought. The airframe was waiting. The war was waiting. What remained was the engine that could carry both into the same sky. The transformation of the P-51 did not come from a single moment of inspiration, but from pressure. Operational pressure measured in lost crews and stalled missions. British test pilots were among the first to see what the Mustang could become. The airframe was efficient, stable at speed, and unusually clean in its airflow. What it lacked was power where it mattered most. Above 20,000 feet, the Allison engine could not breathe well enough to fight on equal terms. The solution already existed. The Rolls-Royce Merlin, with its two-stage, two-speed supercharger, was built for altitude. When fitted to the Mustang and produced in the United States as the Packard Vice 1650, the aircraft changed character. High above the clouds, where bombers labored and fighters hunted, the Mustang now retained speed, climb, and control. By late 1943, the Merlin-powered P-51B and P-51C began arriving in England in operational numbers. What made the aircraft strategically dangerous was not any single performance statistic. It was range. With internal fuel capacity and external drop tanks, the Mustang could escort bombers beyond the old turning points, past the Rhine, past central Germany, and on some missions all the way to Berlin. For the first time, bomber formations could expect escort fighters to remain overhead during the moments that had previously been the most lethal. Early missions tested doctrine as much as machinery. Escort fighters had traditionally stayed tight to bomber boxes, prioritizing immediate protection over initiative. Mustang units were soon given greater latitude. They could range ahead, challenge forming German fighters, and break up interceptions before they reached the bombers. The effect was immediate and unsettling on the other side of the front. German fighter controllers were used to timing their attacks for moments of exposure. Now those moments were shrinking or vanishing entirely. Interceptors climbing to altitude found Mustangs already there. Fighters regrouping after an attack found escort aircraft waiting. The Luftwaffe still had skill. It still had capable aircraft, but it was being forced to fight continuously, without rest, and under conditions it did not choose. By early 1944, the air war over Germany had become something new. It was no longer a series of raids that the defenders could bleed and endure. It was a daily contest of endurance, fuel, pilots, and time, and the P-51 Mustang was now present for all of it. Human angle. For bomber crews, the appearance of the Mustang did not erase fear. It altered its shape. Men still climbed into aircraft, knowing the odds. They still counted engines on the climb and watched contrails form ahead of them like chalk lines into danger. But now, when they looked out across the formation, they saw something different. Fighters holding position longer than expected. Wings rocking in cold acknowledgement. That presence mattered. Crews spoke later of the moment when escort fighters stayed with them past the point where they had learned to brace themselves. It did not guarantee survival, but it reduced the sense of abandonment that had defined earlier missions. For Mustang pilots, the strain took another form. Escort missions were long, physically punishing flights. Cockpits were unheated. Oxygen masks froze. Hands numbed on control sticks at altitude for hours at a time. Fuel management became a constant calculation, not just for survival, but for timing. How long they could remain between the bombers and the threat. German pilots faced pressure of a different kind. Scrambles came more frequently. Engagements were no longer brief. Violent encounters followed by withdrawal. They were extended fights, often against fresh escorts already positioned between interceptor groups and their targets. Losses were not just aircraft, but experienced men who could not be replaced quickly enough. Tactical angle. The Mustang forced a change in how air battles unfolded. Earlier escorts had functioned as shields. The P-51 became a barrier. Instead of reacting to attacks already underway, Mustangs could disrupt them before they formed. They patrolled known assembly points. They intercepted climbing fighters. They pursued disengaging aircraft, preventing reorganization. This did not eliminate bomber losses, but it changed their pattern. Fewer aircraft were singled out. Fewer formations were broken open. The airspace around the bombers became contested earlier and for longer durations. The Luftwaffe now had to fight through an active screen, not wait for an opening. And that shift, subtle at first, began to compound with every mission. Technological angle. The P-51 Mustang was not a miracle weapon. It was a system balanced with unusual efficiency. The Merlin engine gave it power where the air was thin, allowing sustained performance above 30,000 feet. Its laminar flow wing reduced drag, extending range without sacrificing speed. Drop tanks turned fuel into strategy, not limitation. When empty, they were discarded, and the aircraft regained the agility needed to fight. Armament was straightforward but effective. Six 50-caliber machine guns mounted in the wings delivered concentrated fire that was lethal in short bursts. Reliability mattered as much as firepower. Escorts that failed to start, climb, or return were not assets, they were liabilities. The Mustang earned trust by coming back. This combination allowed pilots to choose when to fight and when to stay. In air combat, choice is advantage, leadership, moral angle. Command decisions shaped how that advantage was used. American leadership faced a difficult balance. Staying too close to the bombers limited the Mustang's ability to disrupt the enemy. Ranging too far risked leaving formations exposed. Gradually, escort doctrine evolved. Fighter leaders were given authority to engage threats proactively, not just reactively. This approach carried moral weight. It accepted that some bombers would still be hit. It also accepted that the fastest way to protect future crews was to exhaust the Luftwaffe in the present. On the German side, leadership faced a narrowing set of options. Experienced pilots were lost faster than they could be trained. Fuel shortages restricted flight hours. Orders demanded interception, even when conditions favored the attackers. The strain was cumulative. Morale did not collapse in a single moment. It eroded, mission by mission, until survival replaced initiative. The Mustang did not impose this pressure alone, but it made avoidance impossible, and once avoidance was gone, the air war became a question of who could endure the longer grind. Early 1944. Morning over England arrives gray and layered, clouds stacked like sheets of dull steel. Briefings are short. Routes are long. The target lies deep inside Germany, beyond cities already scarred by weeks of fire and repair. Bombers lift first, heavy and deliberate. They assemble slowly, altitude gained in careful spirals that stretch across counties and coastlines. Fighters join them in stages, thunderbolts, lightnings, and then, holding position with a patience that still feels unfamiliar, the Mustangs. The formation crosses the channel. Flak begins almost on schedule, black bursts marking space more than accuracy. The bomber stream presses on, engines steady, crews counting minutes by fuel flow and oxygen pressure. Then the old line approaches. This is where escorts used to turn away, where crews braced, for the long stretch alone. But the Mustangs stay. They slide outward, upward, spreading across the airspace like sentries taking their posts. German radar stations have already tracked the approach. Fighter fields scramble. Interceptors climb hard, engines straining as pilots search the sky for position and advantage. They expect a window. They expect a moment when the bombers are exposed. They do not find it. Mustangs meet them before the attack forms. Not in a single clash, but in fragments. Pairs diving, sections turning into climbs, brief flashes of fire at closing speeds that leave no time for correction. Some German fighters break off early, forced defensive before they ever see the bombers clearly. Others push through. Those that do find the bombers still guarded. Attacks are made, guns fired, aircraft hit, but fewer formations unravel. Escorts return quickly, cutting off escape routes, forcing damaged fighters downward and away from the stream. The battle stretches across hundreds of miles in several hours. There's no single focal point, no dramatic collapse. Instead, there is persistence. The Mustangs remain. By the time bombs fall and formations turn for home, the air is quieter than it has been over these routes in months. Losses are not erased, but they are reduced. And for the first time on missions of this depth, the bombers are not alone for the most dangerous leg of the journey. On both sides, pilots understand what this means, not as theory, as experience. What followed was not a single decisive battle, but a shift that revealed itself through repetition. German fighter units continued to rise to meet the bombers. They had to. Industry, fuel plants, rail yards, and aircraft factories were being struck with growing regularity. Standing down was not an option. Every raid demanded a response, but the conditions of that response had changed. Mustangs no longer simply guarded, they hunted. After breaking up an interception, they pursued, retreating fighters, forcing them lower, burning fuel that could not be spared, and denying the time needed to reorganize for another pass. Airfields became predictable return points, and escort fighters loitered nearby, waiting for damaged aircraft limping home. Each engagement cost the Luftwaffe something it could not replace quickly. Experienced pilots, new arrivals filled cockpits, but their training hours were fewer. Their tactical instincts were still forming. Against veteran escort pilots flying machines with equal or superior performance, the imbalance grew. The Mustang's range extended the battle beyond the bomb run. Fighters stayed with the bombers through withdrawal, when damaged aircraft were most vulnerable. Stragglers that once would have been marked for destruction now often reached friendly airspace under cover. None of this made the air war safe. It made it survivable. As weeks passed, the effects compounded. German formations attacked in smaller numbers, head-on. Assaults became more desperate. Some units conserved strength by disengaging earlier, knowing that prolonged fighting favored the escorts. American commanders began to see what the data confirmed. Bomber loss rates, while still painful, declined on the deepest penetrations. Mission tempo increased. Targets, once considered marginal or unreachable, became routine. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, entered a cycle it could not escape. More missions meant more interceptions. More interceptions meant more losses, and more losses meant fewer experienced leaders to train those who followed. This was the turning point. Not because the Mustang destroyed the German Air Force in a single season, but because it forced it to spend itself faster than Germany could afford. The sky over Europe did not change color, but its balance did, and once that balance shifted, it did not shift back. The results of the Mustang's arrival were not announced. They were recorded. After the winter of 1943-44 mission, reports began to show a pattern that planners had been searching for since the first daylight raids. Bomber losses on deep penetrations declined. Not disappeared, declined. Enough to sustain operations that had previously hovered near collapse. Crews noticed first. Missions that once felt like gambles now felt like calculations. Damage still came. Aircraft still failed to return, but formations held together longer, and more damaged bombers reached friendly lines instead of falling away into silence. For the Luftwaffe, the cost was harder to measure, but impossible to ignore. Fighter units lost veteran pilots at a rate that training programs could not match. Replacement pilots arrived with fewer hours and less exposure to combat conditions. Fuel shortages limited flight time, reducing both training quality and operational flexibility. The escorts were not just killing aircraft. They were eroding experience. A post-war German assessment would later note that, by 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter force was being committed piecemeal, under unfavorable conditions, and with declining effectiveness. The cause was not singular, but the constant presence of long-range escorts made recovery impossible. The psychological impact followed operational reality. Interception no longer meant a single pass-through bomber fire followed by withdrawal. It meant sustained engagement against fighters that could match or exceed performance and remain in the fight until fuel or damage forced a decision. Every scramble became a risk, not just to aircraft, but to irreplaceable skill. By spring, the air war over Germany had lost its earlier rhythm. What had once been a contest of timing and ambush became a test of endurance, and the Luftwaffe was running out of time. As the months passed, the consequences of sustained air superiority widened beyond the sky. With escorts able to remain over targets and withdrawal routes, Allied planners expanded objectives. Transportation networks were struck repeatedly. Fuel production facilities were hit with growing precision. Aircraft factories dispersed, then dispersed again, sacrificing efficiency for survival. Each adjustment consumed resources Germany no longer had in reserve. The Mustang did not act alone in this process, but it enabled the conditions under which it could occur. Bombers could return often enough to overwhelm repair cycles. Fighters could operate with the confidence that attrition favored them over time. On the ground, the effects became visible before the invasion of Western Europe even began. Rail movements slowed, stockpiles thinned. German units reported shortages that were not temporary disruptions but structural failures. For pilots on both sides, the sky acquired a new permanence. The contrails did not vanish between raids. They returned day after day, at predictable hours over familiar landmarks. The sense of inevitability was not theatrical. It was procedural. American aircrew morale stabilized. Under this rhythm, losses were still mourned, but the campaign no longer felt like an unsustainable wager. German pilots faced the inverse. Survival depended increasingly on avoidance rather than initiative. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe still possessed capable aircraft on paper. What it lacked were trained crews, fuel to fly them, and the freedom to choose when and where to fight. The Mustang's role in this outcome was not that of a singular destroyer, but of a constant presence. It closed distances that had once protected defenders. It removed pauses the Luftwaffe depended on to recover. And once those pauses were gone, the air war accelerated toward an outcome that had become difficult to delay and impossible to reverse. The P-51 Mustang did not end the war by itself. It changed how the war could be fought. Before its arrival, the air campaign over Europe balanced on limits of range, of fuel, of endurance. Bombers struck hard, but paid in crews. Fighters defended skillfully, but relied on gaps in coverage and moments of exposure. The outcome was uncertain, not in theory, but in arithmetic. The Mustang altered that arithmetic. By staying where others could not, it turned distance into pressure and time into a weapon. It forced decisions earlier, drained experience faster, and removed the pauses that once allowed recovery. Its impact was not dramatic in isolation. It was cumulative, measured across hundreds of missions and thousands of hours in cold air. What changed was not just control of the sky, but the relationship between technology and leadership. A capable aircraft, used with intent and restraint, reshaped an entire system of war. For the men who flew beneath its wings, the Mustang was not an icon, it was presence. For those who rose to meet it, it was inevitability. History rarely turns on fear alone, it turns on endurance. And in the long contest above Europe, the P-51 Mustang endured long enough to change the course of the war.